Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, welcome back to the auditorium. I hope everyone enjoyed their brief coffee break. Our fourth session is on conflict mitigation and governance, securing the peace. As such, I would like to introduce and welcome the chair and speakers on stage. This session will be chaired by Ambassador Peter Galbraith. Yes. Indeed, yes. The speakers are Dr. Linda Robinson of Rand Research Institution, Dr. Karen Young of American Enterprise Institute, Ambassador Ramon Blecua, Senior Advisor of Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Brian Katz, Center for Strategic and International Studies, and lastly, Mr. Galip Dalai, Al-Sharak Forum, Istanbul. We will proceed.
Well, I'm glad you're all here. This is a more select audience. What the important thing is that afterwards you talk to your colleagues who are out still having coffee or whatever to make sure they know they really missed something. The topic is incredibly broad, and so there are quite a few questions, and so we're not going to do presentations, and the panel, we want to really have a real conversation here. So there are, of course, conflict and mitigation issues between Kurdistan and Iraq. Can Baghdad and Erbil find a modus vivendi over Kirkuk, sharing of the budget, independent export of oil? And will there ever be a referendum in Kirkuk? And if so, when? Are there changes in the Iraqi constitution that are possible that would strengthen the government in Baghdad and not diminish the powers of Kurdistan? Would a presidential system accommodate Iraq's diverse interests? If you, after all, have a president from one community, presumably a Shiite, what happens then? Does that person really represent the other communities? And what is the long-term future of Kurdistan and Iraq? In a democratic world, is it really possible to keep people in a country that they absolutely want to leave? It's not a close call like, say, in Scotland or Catalonia or Quebec. It's overwhelming. And then on the governance issues, another topic. What's the end game of these protests? We should say these protests in the Shiite parts of Iraq. The protesters say they want to end the sectarian system in Iraq, which they blame on the U.S. for having set up. But is it possible to have a government in Baghdad that doesn't represent the different communities? I mean, does that work in other countries? And then what about the future of the Sunni areas in Iraq? And indeed, are the differences between Sunnis and Shiites actually reconcilable? Have we minimized these differences? And then we want to talk about the outside powers. We want to talk about Turkey, Iran, and a question that engages my interest, has Russia replaced the United States as the dominant power in the region? 1974, Egypt switched sides from being in the Soviet orbit to being in the American orbit. And we've had, since then, the United States has been not only the dominant power, but it's been the peacemaker in the Middle East. You think of Camp David, the Oslo Accords, the Jordan-Israel peace treaty, really taking the lead on the Iran nuclear deal. But is that role now gone? Is it because the U.S. is less important, or is it simply abdicated its leadership? Certainly it was Russia that stepped in. 6 weeks ago, there were U.S. and Turkish patrols in northeast Syria that were being discussed, and now those patrols are being carried out by the Russians and the Turks, and they're Russians in the American bases in Manbij. And then there are questions of economic questions that we want to address. First, can Iraq and can Kurdistan escape? Is oil in a curse? That's a cliche, the oil curse. Can they escape the oil curse? Is it possible to have economic development that benefits people in the kind of chaotic conditions that exist in the Arab part of Iraq? So there are many questions on the table here, and I'm going to toss out some at the beginning. Let's start with the first set. Is a modus vivendi possible between Erbil and Baghdad? I don't know who wants to take that on. Don't speak up all at once, guys.
Well, but that's a very easy one to. You said you wanted me to answer the tougher ones.
Oh, well, you know, I'm helping out. You know, we have to help out our fellow ambassadors. You know, a softball to begin with. Then we'll turn to the academics, the hard questions.
I mean, okay, just I think I can be very brief because it's easier to let the words of the Prime Minister speak for themselves, and the President recently his visit to Baghdad. I think we are living a particularly good moment in terms of Baghdad-Erbil relations. I think many of the outstanding issues are being discussed frankly and openly, and I think in a good spirit of cooperation. There are things that will be difficult.
Well, I mean, this is very diplomatic, but let me bear down on this. You know, they've been discussing them in a frank and full manner for about 14 years. The parliament in Baghdad just passed a law that said Kurdistan's budget had to be reviewed by the finance ministry in Baghdad, which of course is completely contrary to the Constitution or a past precedent. Do you think that there's going to be an arrangement in which Kurdistan's share of the budget, 17%, 12%, is going to be delivered? Will there be an agreement about Kurdistan's independent export of oil?
Well, I think that the will of the government in Baghdad was, at the time in which I was still there, certainly to reach an agreement in that direction. Of course, you can never predict what can be the outcome, and the evolution of politics in Iraq is by its own definition unpredictable. I've never been in a country in the region that is so unpredictable as Iraq, in which things change very rapidly, and there's no, I think, expert that can be sure that certainly things are going to go in one direction or another. And I think you have all been in the same shoes, probably trying to report home what will be, or headquarters, what will be the result of certain course of action. And generally, Iraq always surprises you. It's a very paradoxical country. There's a great political fragmentation, and there is no one decision-making authority or center of power. So I think at the end of the day, the consensus is always shifting. But as things stand, we were on a pretty good footing a couple of months ago. I don't know now, due to the protests, because there's also a lack of clarity, and you mentioned it in your presentation. We don't really know what is the agenda or the end game, what are the interests at play. Some of these demonstrators, because there's no formal representation, are basically self-appointed. So they claim to talk in the name of the hundreds of thousands of people that have been demonstrating, but we don't have any way of really confirming that. So I think that it's very clearly that the constructive role that the KRG is playing, and the importance of the institutional support and the stability that the KRG has been lending to the government in Baghdad is contributing to certainly de-escalate or reduce the possible effects of this political crisis. So I think KRG remains having a definitely influential role, and I think that even if there will always be tensions and probably hiccups and spoilers and people trying to settle accounts, the fundamental structural basis of the relationship is solid and gives hope for I think, a constructive result, in my view.
Anybody else want to take that question on? All right.
Can I go
please.
a little bit further?
Yeah, please.
Take the viewpoint a little bit wider. I mean, I think there actually is a broad consensus on what people who are protesting, not just in Iraq, and you've framed the discussion very much as a domestic politics issue, but I would see it much more regionally. And it's pretty clear. People, you know, from 2011 to the present have been very articulate about what they want. They want good governments, they want jobs, they want economic mobility, they want fairness, they want systems that make them feel that they can be included. And you know, these are really basic things, and those grievances haven't changed. They keep coming up because, as we heard from the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, you know, focus on providing services to citizens and focus on doing it in a clean way that is, you know, not enabling a structure of ownership which is limited to people connected to government and within elite groups. So that's true in Iraq, that's true in Lebanon, that's true in Egypt, that's true wherever you go. So the question to my mind, and my work is not Iraq specific, I work more on the GCC and energy questions, is that how would you create, if it's consensus on, you know, what the problem is, then how would you create models of development and growth which will work, right? And that's what mitigates conflict. That's what sets the stage for, you know, for people to achieve these things that they want.
But aren't you romanticizing a little on that? Because the question is, we agree on what they dislike and what they would like to have. But on how they would like to reach it, there's certainly no agreement. Because, for example, yes, we want jobs, but of course every Iraqi wants a government job. And the problem is that is not what the government is trying to do in terms of reforms and open to the private sector. I've been in many discussions in which sometimes the interventions from some of these civil society people is basically, oh, but the private sector is going to rob the resources of the country. They are here to steal our national wealth. So this is not, you may think that this is a solution, but actually it's not.
Well, I think it's deeper than just poor governance and lack of jobs. I think what we've seen, particularly in Iraq and Lebanon, it is a deeper fundamental challenge to the nature of the political system of the state. This sort of ethno-sectarian-based political system has revealed a real dramatic generational divide. What we're seeing on the streets is people's rejection of identity and sect-based politics and calling for something broader. In many ways, that's an even more deeper challenge to these states than would be just providing jobs or temporary solutions. So to me, the only thing that points for over the longer term is to create the space for new party political formation in these countries. Now, of course, as we've seen in transitions in other countries, that's a long process and it takes time. But over the longer term, it seems unlikely that this generation that maybe isn't as forged by civil war as their parents or grandparents were in places like Syria or Lebanon or Iraq will be looking towards something new and different. And there's going to be a process between preventing the whole-scale collapse of political systems while reforming them to create space for these non-sectarian, maybe issue-based, broader political parties.
I think, the discourse of that is being, demanding, in a sense, a post-sectarian governance structure. That sounds good. Partially it's correct, but I'm not sure to what extent it's actually completely accurate, given the fact that tomorrow, if there is an election, how many of these people will vote to the parties that come from the other sectarian groups? So if even if their political programs are appealing, how many of the Sunnis are willing to vote for the Shia parties, and how many Shia are willing to vote for the Sunni parties? How many Kurds are willing to vote for the non-Kurdish parties? So in this regard, I think we should not, because the discourse of that this is rejection of the identity-centric political or the governance structure usually comes at the expense of undermining or at least downgrading the role of the identity as well too. I think in those countries, people have governance grievances, but identity grievances as well too. I think the grievances of the Sunnis are not just about the delivery, or the grievance of the Kurds was not just about the service delivery. It was like very much identity-centric as well too. So in this regard, I think we should not downgrade, or we should not underestimate to what extent actually this is still has like, you know, the crisis within it's both the governance crisis, but still the identity crisis. Because in the end, most of these countries could not come up with the governance structure or the citizen regime that could accommodate the political activeness of the different community of the country within this same structure. Because we used to talk about like, you know, the Sunni crisis, Shia crisis, Kurdish crisis. Yes, there are like, you know, the Kurdish question. Yes, there are the Sunni crisis in the region. Yes, there is. But like fundamentally one of them was also because these governments completely failed to create the citizenship regime, the governance structure that could at least like, you know, lessen the importance of it. Until and unless this question of identity actually duly addressed, which it has not been addressed, I think, in my opinion. I mean, neither the Kurdish political demands seems to be like, you know, met, nor the Sunni crisis has been like, you know, met in any meaningful way, nor maybe the Shia crisis. I don't think that a service-centric explanation and a service-centric account will be doing the justice to what we are saying.
So if I can just jump in and ask, are you saying then that, I mean, so the discussion is about having early elections. Are you suggesting, and which I think you are, and if you are, I'm inclined to agree with you, that the outcome of new elections is not going to be the emergence of some new non-sectarian party, but significantly the same parties will contest. It may not be the same results, but you're not going to see a real change in the political structure.
I mean, is this like what is being rejected? Is it the governance structure, or is it the identity-based political mobilization that is being rejected? I don't see that the identity-based political mobilization that is being rejected outright. As I said, if tomorrow you can form a parties, let's say like, you know, if a Shia parties come up with a political program that can really appeal to the Kurds, that can really get the votes of the Sunni, then I will say that the people are rejecting the identity-based structure. But I don't see how this is happening, but bearing in mind that I have no expert, I'm not an Iraqi expert per se.
I would like to really elaborate on something that Brian said, because it relates to what you are saying. We are working on the false assumption that Iraqi society is by nature ethno-sectarian. I mean, I asked one of the most prominent statisticians here, what is the number or the proportion of mixed marriages? And he said it's 38%. So you're talking about 38% of mixed marriages. That means that our assumption of this sectarian Iraqi nature is
But how
false.
valid argument is
It's
this?
been imposed because the political leaders in power in 2003 were religious parties interested in stressing the sectarian influence in society.
So I would just add that my attempt in the September issue of Foreign Affairs magazine was to try to take a long view of where Iraq is going. And I do think generationally there's a clear movement beyond the sectarian politics and parties organized around that, in addition to the demographic and marital rates, which have always been true, and it used to be considered bad form to ask someone's sectarian affiliation. So I think that and what I see going on in Baghdad in the last month with these protests is youth really putting forward a new view of politics. They want, it's an issues-based, they want answers, and they want outcomes. And I should start, though, by thanking AUK for this terrific conference. And I think having so many diverse, both international but also Iraqi voices here makes this a very special opportunity. I'm enjoying hearing all the views around the table, and I think the old pigeonholes maybe don't work if we're trying to look to the future. I do want to recognize, though, as I think you're pointing out, there are, and as the Prime Minister in his terrific remarks just noted, and Kubad Talabani yesterday, there's unfinished, unimplemented aspects of the current constitution, and they include resolving some of these chronic neuralgic issues. Article 140, status of Kirkuk in the disputed territories, the hydrocarbons law, and the chronic financial issues that you alluded to. So I think that's part of this mosaic of issues that have to be addressed. But I would point out, I think that Kurdistan's taken an extremely constructive role. It's been part of every constitutional transfer of power in Baghdad. It's been, I think, very constructive in attempting post-referendum to resolve relations with Baghdad. And what I'd like to talk, I won't monopolize the floor here, but I think I've been coming here 2 or 3 times a year since 2003, but very intensively in this counter-ISIS campaign. And we saw both Kurdistan and Baghdad marshal its forces and conduct a very successful military campaign. And I think both entities, the federal government, the KRG, and Baghdad, are to be congratulated, and that momentum should be used to propel further progress on these chronic issues, which we can talk more about.
Well, ISIS
they
gone,
marshaled.
They turned the gun towards each other.
Well, no, to be more precise, the federal government then marshaled its forces against Kurdistan. They didn't, I mean, it wasn't against each other. The victory over ISIS was almost immediately followed by an attack on Kirkuk. So,
Yes, the disputed territories remain to be resolved. That is certainly correct.
but it was actually an attack. But I mean, so you've described
The forces pulled back from
you've argued that the sectarian divide is diminishing in the younger generation, but there's also the national divide between Arab and Kurd. You see anything similar? The New Generation Party, which was the only party that kind of said we ought to stay with Iraq, got very, very few votes in the last Kurdistan elections.
I think many of the indicators that we've all looked for a potential conflict or flashpoint or dissolution of ties between Erbil and Baghdad, many of them are still there. The oil sharing agreements, the status of disputed territories, internal security and prerogative over borders. And we thought we were getting to that flashpoint with the crisis around Kirkuk. And it ended without a full-on separation, and it ended without a full-on conflict. So I guess looking forward, we said it seems unsustainable, but we've been saying that for 16 years. So what would be the compelling mechanism, if it wasn't Kirkuk, that could cause the divide? I don't know what that is.
Well, let's take the question to a bit even outside of Iraq. If there is a civil war context in which the identity groups are involved, is it really at what stage can you really downgrade the role of the identity without addressing the question of identity? Talk about establishing some form of a post-identity governance structures. And this is exactly what we are experiencing with the Arab uprisings. The Arab uprisings, the moment when the Arab uprising become militarized and gain strong identity dimension, I think at this stage 2 things has been clear. One of them, unless and until you address the identity demands of different communities that has been part of these civil wars, we will not have a functioning governance structure or socially acceptable social contracts. And secondly, given that the government itself was in many contexts was responsible or take at least has significant responsibility of what has happened, I think the centralization of power in itself not a solution, rather the part of the problem. I mean, look at Syria. Is right now a strong centralized Syria where you downgrade the addressing the different identity demands of the different community will be a solution, or is this a way out of the crisis? I don't see how it's going to be a way out of the crisis. So in this regard, I still think that if there is the civil war context in which the identity is involved, you have the military struggle, I see no other way but first meeting at least at a reasonable amount of the identity demands of the communities that are involved, and go for more decentralized power and administrative structures.
I want to come back to the Syria question because there's a issue about why did Assad survive when the others
Iran
tumbled? Well,
and Russia.
Well, but it also, I wonder whether identity politics didn't have, or identity didn't have to do this. That is to say, once the uprising became militarized and basically became a Sunni Islamist uprising, if you're an Alawite, no matter what you thought of Assad, the alternative was possibly genocide. For the Christians, it was, a departure to Lebanon. In fact, the slogan early on was, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. And the Kurds never joined the uprising because, again, it was kind of a chauvinist uprising. So, there may have been enough critical mass in Syria because of the identity nature of the country to survive. I mean, does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think it was very underestimated, the fact that this was not either a popular uprising against Assad or a sectarian fight in itself, as a pure conflict. There was a mix of all those issues, and a lot of the Sunni secular middle class stayed with the regime because they didn't like the alternative. Because at the end of the day, it started, or I think for many Syrians, like a replay of the Hama riots and the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. And that was not the alternative they wanted. So at the end of the day, even if you dislike the regime, as you said, the options were pretty bad. So,
well, but is it really domestic dynamics that led to a regime survive this crisis? I mean, I completely agree that the fact that identity became the dominant, one of the dominant themes of this war, this struggle, was a perfect boon for the regime. The moment that it was like militarized, this gave like a perfect, weapon to the hands of the regime to say that he's engaging in a war on terror. And then the fact like around 2014, then we talk about the rise of ISIS. All of them helped the regime. But fundamentally, the reason that the regime was not toppled, because the group that supposedly supported the opposition was less serious than the group that supported the regime. The Iranian, was willing to die on the ground. The Russian, even like, the Lavrov said it clearly, the regime came to us in September 2015. If you don't intervene, we don't know whether we will be in Damascus next month. So fundamentally, it was like, the pro-regime camps proved to be much more serious, whereas like, the anti-regime camp was willing to erase one of their red lines after another one. I mean, in August 2013, if you are not going to act when a chemical weapon is used, when are you going to act?
I think identity is important for having a narrative for your population to keep loyalty. It's important for having motivation to keep fighting. But at the end of the day, what won, at least for now, the civil war in Western Syria for Assad was pure hard military power in the form of Hezbollah, Iranian support, and then Russian air power.
But they had to have something to support. When Ben Ali or Mubarak went, who lost? I mean, Ben Ali and Mubarak, maybe a handful of businessmen, some generals retired and played golf. There would have been a lot more losers in Syria. Let's set that aside. I want to come back. Every time I'm sorry, I have my notes here. Every time I say Syria, Syria pops up.
Assad calling?
No, I'm not interested in Syria. I have some notes here. I want to come back though to finish up on Kurdistan. We had the referendum in 2017. I think there's not a person who says, it was a huge turnout, no violence whatsoever. 92.7% voting for independence. What's the long-term future? How can you keep some people? Do you think people will change their minds about that? And if they can't, can you really keep people in a country forever that they don't want to be part of? I mean, the Soviets thought they'd solve the problem of the Baltics, but they didn't. Perhaps Tito didn't actually think he'd solve the problem of Yugoslavia, but he got through his own lifetime.
But I think here what we have is different. We have to understand this in two different ways. One is that the population can be definitely in favor of an independent state. and at the same time realize that it's not feasible at the moment, or that the alternatives in terms of the consequences could be worse than having an Iraqi state as a protective umbrella in which they could still exercise a maximum level of rights. And I think what we are seeing is a bit of a pragmatic compromise between aspirations and political realities.
Well, let's turn. Anybody else?
Well, I mean, you can stay. Unfortunately, I mean, despite I don't think that the people are going to change their mind. I think like right now, people looking at Baghdad perhaps like feel that their things was justified. But at the same time, yes, you can keep them longer than unfortunately many things when the reality, the outside of reality, is not very permissive. So in this regard, that will be one of the dilemma that the Kurdistan is basically facing. Internally, it seems like many factors is like making the Iraq to fall apart. Like many internal Iraqi factors is like pointing for further disintegration. But it seems like the whole regional and international structures are pushing the Iraq together to say like please don't fragment. And when you are a landlocked, and when you have like surrounded with kind of like hostile countries, in the case of you breaking up, well, the political reality tell us that unfortunately you can be stuck for longer.
So your point is that internally Iraq would break up, and indeed maybe even the current chaos in the south, which is really pretty much a Shiite issue, is yet another opportunity. ISIS was one, but that the surrounding countries hold it together, which of course means that at some point, as when the Soviet Union collapsed, something changes in the surrounding countries, the door opens. But let me move on to another question. I mean, we talked about Kurdistan and Baghdad. But what about the Sunnis and the Shiites? You don't have the protests in the Sunni areas. They're at the moment, I think, pretty beaten down. Some people tell me that if it wasn't for the Iraqi army and particularly the Hashd al-Shabi, ISIS would come back, that the same resentments are there. Is it only because of occupation by essentially a Shiite military that ISIS isn't coming back, or is there some genuine stabilization that's taken place in the Sunni areas? Linda, I think this is your...
Thank you. Yes, Peter, I'm happy to have the moment to talk about the work that we've done on this specific subject and the stabilization efforts carried out in the wake of the military battles against ISIS. And the way we looked at it was there were the bins of the immediate humanitarian response, stabilization, and then the governance, local and national issues, that spectrum of issues would be needed to be dealt with to have an enduring defeat of ISIS, which is still the policy and still the policy of the U.S. to support that outcome. And the report card that we came up with was there were some very significant lessons learned in the first, the liberation of Fallujah. It didn't go so well with humanitarian response. As the cities were liberated, that activity got more efficient. People had resources positioned. Stabilization, there are a number of issues involved there, but one key positive in the way it was implemented, the fund for stabilization was implemented with local decisions made about what were their stabilization priorities. And I thought that was an important model for how to let the local governance decide what they wanted to prioritize and then implement. But we do still have 1.6 million Iraqis displaced. And as the Prime Minister noted, half of those are in the Kurdistan region.
And we might have to say, and most of them, larger number are here in Duhok governorate.
And very
the governor,
large here, yes.
And the people of Duhok, which is the smallest of the Kurdish governorates, are really the ones who've done an extraordinary job as taking care
I've
of them.
visited many of the camps in our research and seen the responses, and I think it's perfectly legitimate and important to get more assistance. The burden on the people of Kurdistan who have had to compete for resources and so forth. So I think there's an important thing there. But it's also critical for this lasting defeat of ISIS that those displaced that don't have a safe place to live, who are in camps in Nineveh, and that's the particular area of concern, and ISIS, people who lived under ISIS occupation and indeed maybe participated. But there is a real problem that if people are marginalized and not given a path backward, and the community calls this the social cohesion issues. Yes, victims, there needs to be justice for the victims, but we also need to make sure there are programs to integrate those individuals back into the system. And then I'll leave the governance issues, I think, for another comment, but I think that's where we're stuck. So I basically say the humanitarian issues, the programs got better, and we get a good passing grade there. Stabilization, a mixed picture, but really the work now is the governance issues, and that's local and national.
Well, I'd like to challenge you a bit on this and come back to the question of the ethno-sectarian debate. First, of course, it was the Iraqi voters who chose in free elections, indisputably free elections in 2005, to vote for sectarian or ethnic parties. The Kurds voted 99% for Kurdish national parties, the Shiites for Shiite religious parties, the Sunnis boycotted the first round, voted for Sunni parties. That the effort of a multi-ethnic party, Alawi, didn't do very well, at least in that round. And if you then looked at this from, we in the United States tended to blame Maliki for having run a sectarian government, but was it really all Maliki's fault? I mean, if you have the Iraqi army.
Yes.
Let me just.
I understand the perspective here, but
no, but let me just run through this. You understand, but for the benefit of the audience. So Maliki, he has the Iraqi army. Who's the enemy? Not Iran. They supported Dawa for decades. Not the United States. The Sunnis. So and why were the Sunnis the enemy? Because they were the enemy. They were the people who hosted the foreign fighters, the attacks on Shiite civilians. So was it so unreasonable as a defensive measure for the Maliki government to operate as it was? And then, when the ISIS did attack, did the Iraqi army behave as if it thought Mosul was an important part of Iraq? No. You had fewer than 1,000 ISIS fighters ousting 30,000 largely Shiite Iraqi troops.
So there were many problems with ISF, and we could go deeply into that disintegration issue, but I think it's really important to note that the 2010 election, the plurality of votes were actually for Ayad Alawi. So I think that was actually a good sign of the evolution that was underway. Now, U.S. influences played what I think was a counterproductive effort in Maliki winding up to be the prime minister, but I think the evolution that I think I've been trying to underline, and rather than relitigate all the chapters we've been through, I think this is so important to look to the future of Iraq and find the path forward, because that is what Iraqis that I see in the streets, and I see their videos and their statements, they're clamoring for a new kind of politics, and I think it's our obligation as observers and researchers to try to help imagine what that pathway is and look at some mechanisms by which that might be achieved.
Also, I think I don't want to look to the past. I think I agree with Linda that we should be looking a little more into the future. But when you mention army, I mean, the Iraqi army was disbanded, was the first decision that Bremer took.
Yeah.
And you cannot call what came after an army. I mean, it was a sort of artificial, how we call it, engineering of a military exercise. And they didn't last for 2 weeks.
No, 36 hours roughly. Yeah.
36 hours, when they actually had to fight a war. So I don't think that is realistic assumption. I think the fact of the sectarian violence has a lot to do with the breakdown in law and order that happened immediately after Bremer's decision. So I'm not very buying, as you can see, on the sectarian narrative.
I suppose one shouldn't relitigate, but in Bremer's defense, and I don't defend him on anything if you read my book, but on this point, it is true that the army had already disappeared, and I was here at the time. So it was a sort of unnecessary assertion of authority to disband something, and it was deeply offensive. But and also whether you could have had a Sunni-led army in what was now a Shiite-led country. I mean, an anti-Iran Sunni-led army in a Shiite, Iranian-sponsored Shiite-led country.
I just have to object to attributing sectarian behaviors to someone's particular religious affiliation, because I know many Sunni and Shia generals and officials that behave in patriotic and nationalistic ways. And I just want to be on record here. And the perfect example of that is the Counterterrorism Service. That's been a long-standing effort by the U.S. to support. And the standards were quality, competence, patriotism. And I know you know this, they fought heavily in every urban engagement, and they took 40% casualties and continued to fight. And I think that's the ethos that I see coming to the fore in Iraq. And I really think that imposing these divisions in this conversation is most unhelpful.
Well, no,
I think it's extremely important that we let us give our points of view here and not cast everything as a sect against sect, Kurd against Arab, because that's not the Iraq that's trying to move ahead.
But do you think that Dawa and Skiri, who were voted for in 2005, were they Shiite, sectarian Shiite religious parties or not?
The Islamist parties have been the organized forces in politics. There have been new parties that have come up, but I think that, as I say, I think Iraq is really in transition now. And I believe, what I do think is unclear is the voice of the people being shown day in and day out on the streets of Baghdad. They want things that and as the Prime Minister said in his remarks, every person wants in Iraq jobs, public services, and an end to corruption. And it doesn't matter what their affiliation is. So what are the policies that are going to get us there? And what is the form of accountability? There is a Commission on Integrity. It clearly hasn't worked. There needs to be new solutions. Maybe electoral forms are part of this. Maybe new parties are part of this. But as I've noted, the last elections, all cross-sectarian alliances. There's already, I think, a beginning of diminishing of these divisions and people starting to move to issues. What we don't have yet in Iraq is results. And that, I think, is what it's incumbent upon the international community to be creative and positive and constructive in helping to, if not fashion those solutions, when Iraqis come up with them, support them. The one thing that there was talk in the previous panel about kind of the muddled, what is the U.S. Policy? I think Ken had mentioned we don't really know because there isn't a very coherent and consistent articulation of U.S. goals vis-a-vis Iraq. There is one clear statement, though, and actually Secretary of State Pompeo made it last week in a written statement that there will be a continuation of support for the Iraqi security forces. And I think that's a very important institutional support to continue the professionalization. You did mention the very lamentable disintegration, which had many roots, but what has also happened is a massive rebuilding effort over the last 4 years of fighting the counter-ISIS fight. And I would just like to add, I think that you have, and I know you're very passionate about a certain set of neuralgic issues that are inhibiting Iraq from moving forward, and Kurdistan as well. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that ISIS is not gone. ISIS can come back, and the country needs to be united in the methods and programs to prevent that.
I would just add, I think a key word Linda used earlier was evolution. And I think the history and study of transitioning from, civil wars into a fragile peace, or the collapse of a state that becomes a democracy, is that the creation of political parties that maybe weren't militias during the war, or maybe didn't have roots that went back deeper, it takes time. It takes time to develop new political parties. So it's always going to give an advantage to those that have existed before. So it makes sense that it was sectarian-based parties that took power earlier on, but it evolves over time. It's the same thing with creating national armies. It takes time to build not only this force cohesion and this shared identity as a national force, it takes time to get the actual capabilities of that force matched up correctly to the fight. I think a lot of blame in Iraq is on the US for what we call mirror imaging, is that we created an Iraqi security forces that was too conventional, so that when ISIS did use its shock tactics in Mosul and storming across eastern Iraq, you had a force that had lost motivation because of lack of support from Baghdad, and one that wasn't equipped to fight. And I think, as Linda said, that has been the US effort with the CTS in the Iraqi army, is to help create a force that can actually deal with the threats that they're likely to face, not one that we would create in our own image.
I want to put a question to Karen, and then I have a question about more internationally, and then I'd like to open it up. But I have to say to Linda, it sort of depends on your perspective, and there's a long history here. But you see it from 2003, but I see it from my first trip in 1984. So of course you get a different perspective on the country, and rebuilding the Iraqi army. The counterterrorism force did a terrific job, but it was a small part of the army. So it remains, shall we say, an open question, a debatable point. But I wanted to ask you, Karen, this is a wealthy country, enormous oil resources. You have all these people who don't have electricity, don't have jobs. Basra, the canals are still full of sewage. What's going on? Why can't they mobilize their oil wealth and deal with this problem?
Well, I'm kind of the odd one out here. I can't speak to Iraqi domestic politics or the Iraqi domestic economy so much, but I can speak to what's happening in the region in terms of the relationship between oil exporters and importers, and the continuation of the reliance on oil for so many states for everything that they do. And Iraq is no exception there. And so again, the frustration is when that service delivery is done well and when it's not. And it's very obvious in oil exporting states when something is wrong. But the one element which I think we have not touched upon, and more from the regional and international perspective, is outside regional actors who are important in the provision of development finance and the provision of support to get things going again. And my work is really focused on the GCC states. And so the role that Saudi Arabia or the UAE has or has not played in Iraq is, I think, also important to think about. But if we look forward 20, 30 years and the way that kind of global energy markets will be, if we think about, okay, if Iraq can kind of harness these resources and get back into its position given the resources that it has as an oil exporter, what's that market going to look like? And frankly, right now, countries like Iraq and Iran are going to be left behind because the energy markets are changing so fundamentally. We're seeing a projection of peak demand. They're basically, we have too much oil in the world. And so the way you take advantage of that resource, if that's the resource that you have, is secure a market that's going to last you 20, 30 years. And those markets, those growth markets, are in Asia. So that's a political decision. That's a foreign policy choice. And secure the technology and the ability to be in the business beyond just sucking out oil from the ground. And that means petrochemicals and plastics, refineries, and owning those assets in multiple locations around the world. And that's what Aramco is doing. That's what ADNOC is doing. That's not what Iraq is doing. Right? And so it's different between national oil companies and international oil companies in the way the concessions work. but it's an industry that is changing, that is preparing for declining demand, is preparing for focusing on certain geographies and markets that are growing, and the political connections that will maintain that consumer base, and that's China, India, but it's also in other geographies where, big countries with a lot of growth potential for the different products, for the plastic straws and things that come from oil. And that's places like Ethiopia and Sudan and Pakistan and Egypt. And so without that work now to make those connections, to own the infrastructure and partner with the Chinese to, own these, whole, kind of supply lines from transport to transportation to port structures, all these things that will give you that captive consumer market 20, 30 years down the line. That's going to ensure the success of economic growth for oil exporters. And Iraq is not in that game. And so I would say that is something, if we're looking at mitigating future risk, is a real loss. And the lack of political cohesion right now and kind of economic planning, I think puts this country at a disadvantage.
Okay, my last question before we open it up for questions is a geopolitical one. Has Russia replaced the United States as the dominant power in the region? And let me key off of something that was said. Russia turned out to be a pretty reliable ally to Assad. Just as he was on the verge of falling, the Russians came in and rescued their ally. The United States, at a moment when the Syrian Kurds had prevailed in March of this year against the Islamic State, the United States, or at least the president, gave a green light for another country, Turkey, to attack them. What does this mean? And of course, then Russia played the role in mediating the settlement that's taken place in Syria, at least for the time being. So is this a moment of American eclipse, American retreat? Is it recoverable if there's new leadership in 2021 in the United States?
I think it's actually the opposite. I think the impression of American eclipse is because of actually America's influence have never been greater. And that's the reason why they don't need, or there's a change in the pattern of its projection of influence. Because we have gone from the geopolitics of oil and the geopolitics of military power to the geopolitics of IT and the geopolitics of finance. And to my understanding, both are based in the US. I mean, it's either Silicon Valley or Wall Street, and you can shut down a country now without firing a bullet. So I think what is changing is the way power is projected and the appearances or the trappings of that projection. So to some extent, it's easy to misinterpret one for the other. But I don't think that we should be kidding ourselves with that kind of illusion. I mean, if you look at Russia's GDP, you're still talking about a GDP that is not much larger than Spain. So even if you have a much different military and political projection, you still cannot pretend to be able to influence global affairs in the same way as an economy that, the whole European Union, the GCPOA gives you the perfect example.
Okay, I was referring, though, to Middle Eastern. It's maybe true but globally, but
European Union tried
is it true in the
to
Middle
circumvent US secondary sanctions. And it was impossible because at the end of the day, no matter how many bypasses you make, you end up going back to the dollar-dominated financial system.
The issue, though, it's not a projection of American power necessarily, because these, IT firms or technology firms are going to be owned by shareholders, right? So those people can be anywhere and often are owned by sovereign wealth funds and, people back here in the region or entities back in the region. So this is, but I do agree with you that the projection of Russian influence is a perception issue. It's definitely, and it has to do with this authoritarian affinity within the region between rulers, and the sense that when you shake Putin's hand, you can trust him because he'll follow through. And I've heard this from leaders in the region, and it's very much an ideological kind of issue, but it's not about military.
We're talking though about a situation which has a military dimension. So,
Yes.
so go ahead.
I think one of the things, I mean, the difference between the US and Russia, one of the major differences, Russia now is quite focused in the region. Russia does not try to be like, present influence or power in all over the region. It has like quite focus. It's like, very focused on the Eastern Mediterranean area. It was like in Syria, and like, now try to like kind of tap into the Gulf arms market. It tried to like, establish better relation with the energy exporting countries. But nevertheless, Russia is not trying to like be present in every single crisis in the region, which US to some extent has to be present, or at least it was the expectation that it has to be present in every single crisis. The second thing I think with Russia, yes, right now many countries say it's like, there is in a sense the reliability of commitment. The Russia does honor its things. But the question is it Russia or Putin? Because sometimes the question that we have with the authoritarian structure, we look at the nature of the authoritarian rule, and we attribute more power to this. I think right now most of in a sense, what is being described as Russia's reliability of the commitment is to a great extent is Putin.
Is it America or is it Trump?
Well, it is America, it's Trump, but that we realize that there is more than Trump in America as well, too. I mean, this is not like to give more credit to Americans, but nevertheless, you see in the end, different institutions are trying to like do different things. But in Russia, if Putin tomorrow decides that he's going to do something, he's going to do something. So I don't think that the Russian institution will be able to like, maneuver Putin the same way, at least like, Pentagon could do, I mean, this is the perception outside, with Trump for at least a year. But what I am saying, like the discourse of he's going to be the dominant is the wrong discourse. I don't think that neither Russia nor US is going to be the dominant in the region. Now we will be going more and more the different crises where the different actors will have like, more to offer and more to say. And another thing that highlighted that we will see, instead of very institutionalized and structured relationship that usually this is the type of the relationship that the US enjoys with the region countries, we might see like the issue-based, in a sense, like what we saw with Astana framework. If we tomorrow see a similar framework that is being applied, let's say to Libya, can be, yes, technically it can be. I mean, will it be? I don't know, but can it be? Yes. I think like what we are going to see, we might see for different crises, we will see the constellation of different group of power that inserting more and more influence. And the regional powers is relatively increasing its share when it comes to deciding on the regional issues. I mean, the regional powers, I think right now, I will say like, if you project 10 years from now, I will say like the trajectory of the increase in the regional powers shaping of the regional affairs will continue to increase. I don't think that it's going to be the other way around. I don't think that we will see like, 10 years from now where the US will have like more influence than it does today, or where the Russia will have more influence than it does today as well too. As I said, I think like the Russian foreign policy right now, I don't think that it has like a very overall framework of its Middle East policy. It's quite short-termist, it's quite opportunist. I mean, I don't know whether Russia has entertained any special relationship with anyone. Even the question of Assad is disputable, whereas you can talk about like the US special relationship with certain countries. Can we really talk about the Russian special relationship with any countries? And the last thing, Assad maybe, but this even I would put a question mark, because Assad is still like, the cow that Russia uses like to get like the things from the other actors. The last thing I think like, for countries like Iran, is Russia, China, is their preferred partner, or is this something that they are stuck with because of the sanctions? If tomorrow there is a sanction relief, would Iran still be more into engaging with China and Russia, or would it be like actually would be more interested to engaging with also Europe and the US? I think in this regard, like the Russian moment, I'm skeptical. Yes, the Russia does, does deliver in a very focused areas, but Russian means is quite limited, and I think we have to make a distinction between what is Russia, what is Putin as well too.
Okay, well, thank you. So your judgment, the U.S. is still a very important player, but there are other players I suppose one question, but I'm not going to.
No, the US
look at
credibility has
an
been very
answer to it
dented.
is also Turkey and Russia's relations with Turkey. But I really want to give some room to the audience. Let's see. The governor, please. Please.
Farhat Atrushi, I used to be a member of parliament in Baghdad for 4 years, so it's important to say something because for us it's very important for researchers, academics like you to understand exactly what is happening in Iraq. I haven't said this, but I will say it. I was at the very center of I will not say the decision maker, but someone who is participating in preparing the decision for the decision makers in Kurdistan, in Baghdad, to have a decision. For the negotiation of the budget, Iraqi budget for the 4 years, I was the one representing KDP in all our negotiations with the other parties, with the government, including Haidar Abadi. He was the chairman of the finance committee at that time. Not very close friend of mine, but I have dealt with him for 4 years. There is a very important thing we should know, that in regards to the constitution, it's not only what is related to Kurdistan not being implemented. What is related to the very structure of the Iraqi state has not been implemented. For example, I will give you very quickly some examples. Iraq should have, yesterday I think we have discussed this one in our workshop, Iraq should have 2 houses for legislation. Now we have 1. And there is Article 65 mentioning about the upper house, which is the Senate or whatever you want to call it, but we don't have it. And there is a very critical issue in the Constitution itself. That's why I am in favor of amending the Constitution, because there are certain issues should be amended, should be changed. One of them is this. There are no details of the upper house in the Constitution. And this is a big constitutional problem. It says that there must be a legislation by the Council of Representatives in detail to mention the powers and the privileges of the Senate, which is wrong constitutionally. This is one thing. The second thing, we have the High Court, which is the Supreme Court. It should be based on the Constitution. But this High Court, which we have, it's based on an order from Paul Bremer in 2004. And still the same judges, for 16 years, they are playing a very important role in a very critical political issues between different components of Iraq. And still they refuse to have a High Court. Again, I was in that committee. We discussed a lot with our brothers, especially Shia. The article says that there must be a High Court, but then the number is not mentioned. So we disagreed on whether they will be 13, they will be 17, they will be 11, they will be 9. So there were different of opinions. But the major issue was, you know what was? The Shia brothers were insisting that clerics, Islamic scholars, should be the majority among the section which is related to have some Islamic experts in the court. This is what mentioned in the article, constitutional article. We didn't allow that. We didn't agree. We said this is a court. This is not a mosque. This is not a church. This is not an Islamic school. This is a court. They didn't accept. They said there must be some Islamic experts from Sunnis and from Shia, but the majority should be from Shia. This is another issue. The third thing, which is very important, the very basis of this constitution, the philosophy of the Iraqi constitution was based, was written on at least 2 things: democracy and federalism. Democracy and federalism. But the actions of all governments were very anti-federalism by action. I will give you examples. All ambassadors, all military leaders, divisions, and upper, let's say, high commander, high-ranking officers in the army, in the police, especially in the army, they should come to the parliament and approved by the parliament. No one did that. No Maliki, not Abadi, not Ibrahim Ja'fari, and now even Dr. Adel Abdel Mahdi is not doing that. The parliament is doing deputy ministers, special ranking officials or bureaucrats in the government should be approved by the parliament. They didn't do that. The funny thing, the Shia were very interested in a law which was how to establish new regions in Iraq, because if you have a federal country, you should have more than one region. We have one region, which is Kurdistan, and we have a very strong central government with 15 governorates, which is very abnormal. In 2007, they were very enthusiastic to legislate this law. We did it very quickly. The Kurds supported them. We had a law, and still we have it, with very clear mechanism and tools to establish new regions. 4 governorates, they applied in different times to al-Maliki government to establish new regions. He refused. Basra, Salahuddin, Anbar, and Nainawa. And he said, I will not allow any region to be established. So it's a question of centralism versus decentralization or federalism, which is very basic for us. Yes, I do agree with you. We want to stay in Iraq, but we have compromised, all of us. We compromised. We didn't ask for independence, but we are not allowing them to tell us, yes, you are our brothers, you are Iraqi citizens, but you should learn Arabic, you should change all your culture, you should not learn your language. This is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. Yesterday also we discussed. One person suspended the budget of 6 million people by one signature. This is not a country we wished and we worked for. And this is not acceptable. In the Constitution, again, in Article 105 and 106, it talks about the federal agency responsible for collecting revenues, which is very important. That agency should be federal one, represented by KRG and all other provinces. Revenues will go there, and they will decide whether 17% is for KRG, or 20%, or 15%, I don't care. But the Prime Minister would have nothing to do with that. But now what is happening, the Prime Minister, one individual, is the one who is deciding everything, whether to give me 15, or 17, or 10, or 12. This is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. There are more than 55 constitutional articles should be followed by legislations, a lot of laws and legislations. They did nothing. They did nothing. By the way, I was in Oil and Gas Committee. Karen, I have a question. Every year, we were very important part of preparing the budget because Iraq is mainly depending on oil revenues. Sometimes I remember they will say 94% of our revenue is from oil. If what you have said in your last comment, if it's correct in 20 or 30 years from now, what will happen to Iraq? I mean, really, it's a big question. We are depending a lot on oil and gas. So what will happen? How these people will be fed? This is a very important question. Sorry, Peter, I took a lot of time.
No. I was delighted because I think you shed a lot of light on the situation. I might add that the budget was cut off even as the Peshmerga were the only force stopping ISIS. But Karen, on oil and gas.
Well, I mean, if the majority of your fiscal revenue is from oil exports, I mean, that's a problem, right? And that's why we see these diversification agendas across the region of oil exporters. But it's hard to do. And what's happening instead is kind of diversification light, where national oil companies are getting into the affiliated businesses, right? And that's the strategy. They're also doing a whole lot of other things in terms of like co-investments with their sovereign wealth funds in other countries. I mean, Russia and the Russian fund has a co-investment fund with every GCC oil exporter, right? And so the idea is to put money together and then put it in other places in the world, in equity markets or wherever, to have a growth strategy. So that's the planning ahead that other oil exporters are doing. But the environment's going to be totally different. And if that revenue proportion stays the same, it will mean that there will be less money, right? And there will be less flexibility for governments to make decisions about how much you spend on health or education or defense or anything else, because there'll just be less in that pot to go around.
Okay,
So.
let me...
And don't forget, just to reinforce the argument, that the population growth of Iraq is absolutely unchecked, and it will double, and the problem will grow exponentially as there's a decline in income and there's an increase in the let's say demand for social services.
I'm going to cut this off because there are other questions, and we have about 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask for a series of questions, and then just, so very quick questions, and they finish with a question mark. Go ahead.
Actually, I want to ask my question to Linda Robinson. Arzu Yılmaz from Hamburg University. I want to address my question to Linda Robinson. I'm trying to closely follow up the unity of Iraq discussions for a long time. And what I understand is particularly after the emergence of ISIS, the discussions on the unity of Iraq is going beyond one Iraq policy. And whatever we have been witnessing, particularly in the last 2-3 years' time, within the context of the reconstruction of Iraq process, and as if a new nation state, the intention seems to be like reconstructing a new nation state. It is, open for discussion whether the unity of Iraq or, let's say, a nation state is possible or not, or the unity of Iraq, does it really rely on the internal dynamics, or is it a geopolitical necessity? So just, I would like to really hear your comments on the geopolitical rationale. What is the geopolitical rationale of imposing top-down, engineering or whatever you say, geopolitical rationale of the such a policy? Thank you.
Okay. Over here.
It's him and Mirkhan from University of Kurdistan. I have to be honest, we supposed to leave, but we stayed. I'm glad we stayed. What a wonderful panel, by the way. My question it's going to be with Linda and my friend from Sharp Institute. The problem with it, we have this structural problem in Iraq, and there are a lot of studies that Iraqis do not believe in capitalism. So are we looking for a new model, maybe like a Turkish model? They call it like Islamic Calvinism or something like this. Right.
Okay, so
this is for Linda and yeah.
Okay, second, over here. I'm good.
Yeah, William Morris, Next Century Foundation. Just, I mean, on the sectarian point, I was monitoring elections in 2010 and since. And, of course, Alawi won that election, and the kids in Mustansariya or Babel University, many of them were voting for Alawi. He'd never have won without Shiite votes. And some of them were voting for extraordinary people. But there was very cross-sectarian lines voting. I mean, some of them were voting for Mithal Alusi, who just visited Israel. I mean, it was extraordinary how broad the vote was. But now we're talking about reform, and clearly there's a reluctance for constitutional reform, despite what the governor would like to see. But there is an agreement or a consensus that there must be some electoral law reform And three things that seem to be being talked about. One is abolishing the governorate councils, which is perhaps disturbing. The other is the concept of going back to the pre-Maliki kind of government, where you had electoral lists that went across party lines and right across the country, because you had a one nation constituency. And the other, the final option, which seems to be coming in from the president of Iraq, whether it's going to gain any traction at all, is the idea of very small constituencies that have individual one or two representatives. Do the parties see, do anybody here see these radical ideas for electoral law reform as being credible?
Okay, three questions, and I'm afraid that's what we have time for. Linda, you've got two of them, I think.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief, but thank you. And I appreciate your question. And I'd like to say, first of all, I think our stabilization study, post-ISIS, Making Victory Count, had as one of its central recommendations the decentralization as a pathway, not only to satisfy demands in the provinces that have previously requested to form governance, but I think it's what the Constitution says, and absolutely, I think, would help address the issue. And if that is the path that Iraq chooses, I just want to make clear, I am not trying to impose any model of unitary Iraq. This is completely up for Iraqis to decide. But I think the question of the geopolitical neighborhood, Iraq may be stronger if it holds together. And I didn't get to chime in on the issue of Russia and Syria, and I think they're clearly the playmaker in Syria now. And that's a combination, I think, of both their risk tolerance and opportunism, but the US and President Trump has been extremely clear that he wanted troops out of Syria. So I think that creates a real prospect for ISIS to regenerate there and create more pressure on Iraq. So I think that the neighborhood's very dangerous for Iraq. And maybe I'll take quickly the statist economy. I think that's a brilliant point, and that was the Ba'athist model for so long, and I think it ties into both of these comments about Iraq's way ahead has to be to generate private sector growth. It can't be the model simply to employ more and more public employees. It's already one of the highest public employee roles in the world, if not the highest.
Okay, let me, electoral system, last point. Anybody want to take that?
Ryan.
I analyze war.
Okay, well, I was somewhat involved in this in 2005. And of course, whatever electoral system you choose very much makes a difference to the outcome. If you go to single-member districts, you probably, probably makes it much harder for parties that are not identity parties. I mean, I would imagine that in the Kurdistan region, if you had single-member districts, it would, you would have only KDP and only PUK, and you probably would have the same result for sectarian parties in other parts of Iraq. You probably will get the most diverse result if you went back to the system by which the Constituent Assembly was elected, which is nationwide lists, and you'll have all the issues of coalition building. Well, let me.
I was going to say where you see electoral lists is in Lebanon, and what that shows you is that it strongly favors the existing parties who have the ability to mobilize their voters and have the sophistication to manipulate the electoral system. That won't answer the needs of the protesters who maybe want a more independent party. It would take long for them to develop the capabilities to compete in that system.
In a single member.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably right. But, in the end, the electoral system's not always determinative. Just don't have an electoral college. Okay. Sorry. Well, thank you all very much. I wish we could continue, but we have another panel coming up shortly. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you to the speakers. This concludes our fourth session for today. Now we will have a brief 15-minute coffee break, and then we'll continue with our fifth and final session.